Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we are going to go ahead and start our archetype breakdown for Ikoria now that the whole set has been spoiled. I'm making videos that are kind of showing you what the color pairs are trying to do in the set. I did this with the previous set, Theros Beyond Death, and it worked out pretty nicely, although this set is a little bit different because it is focused more on 3 color combinations with some 2 color combinations thrown in the mix. There are some color pairs that don't really have well-defined archetypes because they're meant to fit more into the 3 color pair that they were designed for. But to start things off, we are going to talk about the 2 color counters or ability matters archetypes. Each of the allied colored pairs cares about a certain keyword, and they've been fleshed out with a certain, cycle of rares, commons, and uncommons that care about their specific mechanic and find ways to put those counters on other creatures to make that mechanic more prevalent. So that's going to be our first video here. We'll probably follow up with a video on cycling and mutate and so on and so forth. There's a human archetype and a human matters non-human archetype floating around the set, so there's a little bit going on here. Remember, if this video has done anything to help you prepare for the limited format coming up, or you found it entertaining or informative or anything in that vein, feel free to subscribe below to show support. You can leave a comment below if maybe I misspoke about something or forgot something, or if you just want to go ahead and give a shout out, feel free to do so in the comments, or find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks, and let's go ahead and jump into this thing. Thanks for joining me. So right off the bat, we are going to start with green-white. Green-white is the Vigilance Matters archetype, and even though it's got enough cards to flesh it out, I don't think this is going to be one of the more popular or prevalent ones, just because people tend to, think Vigilance isn't as good as some of the other mechanics, and surely it's not. Vigilance on small creatures tends not to matter, but vigilance on big creatures and beaters tends to be pretty decent. So we're going to go ahead and start off all the videos by talking about the specific rares that would push you into this archetype, because this is more often than not how you end up in a specific archetype, is you pick up a rare and then you kind of start picking your commons and uncommons to match that rare. Whether or not that's right or wrong, we'll leave for another video. But for the Vigilance Matters archetype, your gold rare card is Nonlin Felidar. This is 2 green-white for a 3/5 Vigilant Cat Beast at rare, and it says creatures you control with Vigilance have 1 mana, tap it, tap target creature. So we will see a gold rare for each of these 5 archetypes today. This one being actually a very, very good one, right? Turning all of your Vigilance creatures into tappers is quite strong. Remember, Vigilance plays offense and defense very well, and putting that on big creatures is nice, but being able to just get blockers out of the way or attackers out of the way is very sweet as well. If I had a Nonlin Felidar in my card pool, I would try to actively start drafting Vigilance creatures just because they all turn into tappers. This means if you want, you can probably prevent your opponent from ever attacking or blocking if you have enough Vigilance creatures on board. It only takes 2 or 3 before you're stopping your opponent's best creatures from engaging in combat. And remember, the trick with Vigilance is that you can attack with the creature and then before blockers activate a tap ability. Kind of a nice little combination of tap abilities and Vigilance on a creature. So Nonlin Felidar is kind of your go-to rare that's going to push you into this archetype, and it is in fact a very good rare. There is also Kahira the Orphan Guard. This is the companion for green-white, but I'm going to more or less ignore the companion cost here. I'm treating this as though it's a rare that you would put in your deck if you were drafting green-white. And due to the hybrid nature, this doesn't necessarily have to be a green-white card. You can play it in green-red or white-black or what have you, but it does have Vigilance and it's a green-white card, so we're going to go ahead and talk about it here. Basically, it's a 3-mana 3/2 Vigilance, which isn't super exciting. You want Vigilant on high toughness creatures for the most part, not high power creatures, even though that does fill a role in and of itself. And it says each other creature you control that's a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or beast gets +1/+1 and has Vigilance. And in fact, a lot of the other cards that we'll see, if not all of them, happen to be one of these creature types. It just so happens the design of the set means that most creatures you are going to draft, especially in green-white, are of those creature types, and that means Kahira is basically a Vigilant Lord as well for this green-white deck. It's not often you're going to get this card. It is just a good enough solid card that can fit in a lot of different decks that you're not going to get past it or anything of that nature. It's not quite as good as Nonlin Felidar either, but it is a very good card that we should mention here. If you first pick it, then you have a couple different routes. You can go towards those creature types, but you can also start pushing towards the Vigilance route as well. For each of these archetypes, I want to talk about a cycle of uncommons, rather two cycle of uncommons, starting with the bonders. There is a bonder in each of the allied color pairs that cares about having the archetype, or rather the keyword for that archetype, on as many creatures as possible. Alert Heat Bonder is 1 and double hybrid green-white mana, so 3 mana total for a 2/4 Vigilant Uncommon Human Scout. They're all uncommon humans, and at the beginning of your end step, you gain 1 life for each creature you control with Vigilance. So this is going to make it very hard for your opponent to kill you. Just having this sitting on board gains you incidental life, and it's a pretty decent on-curve creature as well, being a 3 mana 2/4. Vigilance, is obviously better than not, but is not a huge selling point. It just means that you're going to gain at least a life for having this on board, plus gain additional life for every other Vigilance creature you control on your end step. This is not the reason to go into the Vigilance archetype, right? You don't first pick this card and then start drafting a bunch of Vigilance creatures, because the payoff is just gaining life. But if you are already in green-white, or you're pushing in that direction, this is one of the best cards you can get rewarded with. And then each of these, well, almost all of these ability archetypes have a mentor, which is going to vary in mana cost and stats, but have basically the same effect, just swapping out whatever keyword you're talking about. In this case, we will talk about Keen Sight Mentor, which is 2 and a white for a 1/4. They are all uncommons. They are all humans. I don't believe they're all clerics, but they are all uncommon humans that say when it enters the battlefield, put a blank counter, in this case a Vigilance counter, on target non-human creature you control. And they all say non-human as well. So face value, Keen Sight Mentor is a 3 mana 1/4 that puts a Vigilance counter on another non-human when it enters the battlefield. Not super exciting. 3 mana 1/4 is not that good. A Vigilance counter isn't doing too much, but all of the mentors have an added ability that say pay a certain amount of mana, in this case 1 and a white, and tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with the chosen keyword, right? So for Keen Sight Mentor, you pay 2 mana and tap it, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control with Vigilance, and they're all going to be good, right? Every one of these mentors is good because they get things going by putting a counter of their type on another creature, and then they can start at least growing that creature with the activated ability. But if you have a mass of Vigilance creatures, Keen Sight Mentor is going to grow them all at the same time, and that means your board can get very much out of control. We're going to repeat that a lot with the mentors because they're all going to play the same way. In this case, again, Vigilance is not the best ability compared to some of the other ones, but being able to grow a Vigilant creature is quite nice since it puts it in a position to be a good attacker plus a good blocker at the same time. So just give a couple stats here. Besides the 2 cards we just looked at, there is only one other Vigilant uncommon in this entire set. That brings the total to 3 uncommon Vigilance creatures, which is not a lot, but is more than we'll see for some of the other abilities in this video. That uncommon is Majestic Auricorn, which is a 5 mana 4/4 Vigilant creature, and whenever it mutates, you gain 4 life, plus it can mutate for 4 mana. It's a fine card. It's not really something that you're looking to play too often, but if you are in the Vigilance archetype, it's going to be a little bit more exciting. Now, moving on to the commons, there are 5 common Vigilant creatures in this set, with one of them being Farfinder, which I expect to be a creature that most other players at the draft table will want, so I don't expect to get this one late. There's also a Cyclone creature in Imposing Vantasaur, which is going to be a card of interest to anybody playing Cyclone decks. There's also Flycatcher Giraffid, which is just a fine vanilla creature due to its ability to have reach and just be a mammoth spider. But Main Serval and Mosscoat Goriac are kind of not amazing creatures that other players won't be super interested in, so a lot of these cards are the type of things that will wheel in a draft, which is kind of a benefit of the Vigilance Matters archetype, is that your keyword isn't as cool or interesting or effective as some of the other keywords. So your cards aren't as interesting, which means if you end up in the archetype, you can probably wheel some of the key commons that you're looking for. But 5 commons is a decent number alongside 3 uncommons, means that there is definitely support for the Vigilance archetype here. And a couple other things I wanted to mention here. There are a few cards that are specific to each of the archetypes that you can play in any deck, but get better if you care about that keyword. In this case, Vigilance Matters has solid footing. It is a white mana for a flash aura that gives an enchanted creature +1/+1, and if the enchanted creature has Vigilance, it deals damage based on its toughness rather than its power. So it Doran's up or Arcades up a Vigilant creature. You can play this in a non-Vigilant deck, and it won't be very good, but if you do play it in a Vigilance deck, you note that most of the creatures we saw have higher toughness than power, so it does turn it into a much better beater, and it still has Vigilance, so it can attack and block as well. And I want to mention Vivienne here. I'm not going to read the card, but it does +1 to make 3/3s, and you have a choice of putting a Vigilance counter on it. The reason we're not going to talk about it in depth here is because, A, you're probably going to choose Trample counter more often than not if you are on offense. If you are in defense, then a Reach counter might be better than a Vigilance counter. So very rarely will this actually be a Vigilant creature maker. And also Vivienne's kind of an absolutely insane card for limited, so it doesn't really matter that it has the keywords attached. It's just going to be a good card regardless of what archetype you land in. That brings us to our next archetype, which is definitely very much fleshed out. That is the Tramples Matters archetype in red and green, and we'll follow kind of the same pattern here, looking at the rares first, starting off with kind of the Trample Matters rare of the set, Quartzwood Crasher. 2 red, green for a 6/6 trampler. It is a rare dinosaur beast. So already off the bat, 5 mana, 6/6 trample is a very powerful card. It does have some stringent mana requirements, but you're willing to pay that for a 6/6 trample on 5 mana. It also has a completely busted combat trigger that says whenever 1 or more creatures you control deals trample damage to an opponent, create an XX green dinosaur beast creature token with trample. And I misread that. It's whenever a creature with trample deals combat damage to a player, you make an XX green dinosaur creature token with trample, where X is the amount of damage those creatures dealt to that player. So anytime you deal damage, combat damage to one of your opponent, to an opponent, and the damage was dealt by a trampler, you are going to make a token that has trample, so you can kind of get this chain going, and the trample damage is going to be equal to the amount of damage you were able to push in there. So what this means is if you attack with just this thing on its own and it gets through, it doesn't get chump blocked or anything like that, it's going to deal 6 damage to your opponent, and you're going to create a 6/6, and now you have 12 points of trample on board, and if any of that gets through on your opponent the following turn, you're going to make another dinosaur, maybe even a 12/12, and then the game is basically over. This also means if you get blocked, let's say Quartzwood Crasher is attacking, and it gets blocked by, I don't know, a 3/3, well, 3 of your damage is still going to trample over, and you're going to create another 3/3 with trample. So you kind of see this chain reaction where if the Quartzwood Crasher isn't dealt with immediately, and it gets basically any meaningful amount of damage in on the opponent, it's just going to spiral out of control because that's just more trample damage you have on board. It also counts just other creatures dealing trample. Even if the Quartzwood Crasher doesn't deal damage itself, but some other trample creature gets in, you are going to make a token. And the fact that those tokens have trample is just kind of incredible to me. So Quartzwood Crasher is kind of the key card that's going to push you into this trample archetype. It is worth first picking despite the gold requirement, and it is just extremely powerful. Like I said, if you don't deal with this card right away or have an efficient way to stop it from dealing combat damage to you, you are probably going to lose the game basically immediately. Next up is Yadaro, Wandering Monster. This is, for all intents and purposes, a 7 mana 8/8 trample haste creature with cycling. I'm not going to bother reading the cycling text because that's not super relevant for limited, but it is a giant trample haste creature, and that is why you are playing it. Cycling is obviously a big upside on expensive cards, but this is a big, huge beater that can come out of nowhere, and it does have trample, even though this ends the game so quickly that it might not really matter what synergies this has with other cards, because it is just going to attack a couple times and win the game, right? There is also Gem Razor, which is just a generically powerful trample creature. It's a 4-mana 4/4 with reach, trample, and whenever it mutates, destroy an artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. The mutate cost is 1 green. This is actually a monster of a card because you can get a 2-drop on board and then mutate on turn 3. You just have this 4/4 attacking on turn 3 with a relevant mutate trigger and 2 relevant abilities. Reach and trample means this plays offense and defense extremely well. And while, again, this is just generically powerful enough that you don't care too much about synergies or anything like that, you don't have to first pick a Gem Razor and then start moving into a trample archetype necessarily. It is just good enough on its own. It still has all of these synergies nonetheless. Same with Yodara, right? Powerful card that you're probably happy first picking, but not quite as archetype specific as Quartzwood Crasher. I do also want to mention that there are 3 mythics in this set that care about trample or have trample. One of those, again, being Vivienne, but 2 of them being the 3-color Apex creatures, which are just kind of all busted cards in general. It doesn't really matter so much that they have trample because neither of them, well, actually, Aluna is red-green, Brokos is not, but some of the synergies that we mentioned here are going to still apply to those creatures just because they happen to have trample. If you first pick these cards, you're going to do your best to try and play them because they're kind of upsettingly good in limited, but it doesn't really necessarily, again, push you into the trample archetype. It's just a direction you can go once you have these cards in your pool. And that brings us to our uncommon cycles. We have the Wild Bonder. Proud Wild Bonder is our uncommon bonder for trample. It is 2 and double Gruul hybrid mana, so 4 mana total for a 4/3 uncommon human warrior with trample. It is nice that these bonders have the ability themselves. And it says creatures you control with trample you may have this creature assign its combat damage as though it weren't blocked. So keep in mind, that's a little bit of a double-edged sword. It does mean sometimes you push in with a bunch of trample creatures and your opponent's blocks don't matter because you're just sending in lethal damage and you have the choice to say, okay, my creatures are going to deal damage as though they weren't blocked. You're just going to take all this damage anyway. The way that turns into a double-edged sword is that if you are engaged in combat and your opponent's blocking and you choose to deal damage directly to your opponent, you're not dealing damage to their creatures, which means that you're probably going to lose some of your creatures and your opponent's not. Obviously, you're doing that because you're going to get a ton of extra damage in that way, and sometimes this means your opponent can't win and can't stop you from just swinging for lethal. Plus, trample creatures tend to be pretty big, and this itself has trample. So it makes all of your trample creatures have super trample, if you will, as people like to call it. Makes them effectively unblockable if you're pushing in for the win. And this creature already has good stats on its own, so I expect this one to be very powerful and end quite a few games. Your mentor for trample is Hornbash Mentor. It's 2 and a green for a 3/3 uncommon human warrior. When it enters the battlefield, put a trample counter on target non-human creature you control, and this one costs 2 and a green to tap it and put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with trample. So 3 mana 3/3 is already a good baseline. Given another big creature, hopefully trample is very nice because trample is nice on big creatures. That is one thing about trample, right? It basically doesn't matter on really small creatures unless those creatures are going to grow over time, but it is really big on big creatures. It's, a make it or break it ability on just a giant creature. And there are some giant creatures in this set that don't have trample that would really love to gain trample. Plus, being able to put +1/+1 counters on creatures with trample is really nice because they tend to benefit quite a bit from having extra power and toughness. Hornbash Mentor seems like a solid rate creature that you would just play in any green deck. You're not playing the white one too often, or at least you're not excited about the white one. You're still going to play it, but the green one you're actually excited about if you're not in the trample archetype, and it is obviously extremely good if you are in the trample archetype. So moving on, again, besides those two, there are 2 uncommon cards that are essentially trample creatures, although they're a little bit interesting in this case. Titanoth Rex is a 9 mana 11/11 trampler. And there is ramp, there is a few reanimation spells, and this thing has cycling, so it's easy to get into the graveyard. So there are ways to kind of cheat this creature into play, in which case it is the biggest creature on board, no doubt. It is just the biggest thing you can make in the set without the help of a certain rare that we'll talk about. Obviously, this card is going to be cycled more often than not, and when it's cycled, it does put a trample counter on another creature. So even if this itself is not wreaking havoc on the board, it is going to turn something into a trampler, which kind of fits the same bill of being a trample creature. There's also Reptilian Reflection, which has the option of becoming a 5/4 trample haste creature, but you do have to cycle cards. I'm still treating this as a creature because it might as well just be a creature that can't attack or block unless you've cycled, and it does fit the bill as something that can be a trample creature. So all in all, 4 uncommon creatures that have trample or grant trample to other creatures, which is not bad. That's up from the 3 we saw in the Vigilance archetype. Outside of that, there are 4 common creatures that either have trample or can gain trample. Note that Ferocious Tigerilla gains either trample or menace, so we'll talk about this card again here in a couple moments. But these are all pretty decent stat line creatures. Pyroceratops cares more about the spells matters archetype, but it happens to have trample. And Bushwag is here kind of as a nod to the Mutate archetype, and it's basically just a joke anyway, but it tramples as well and can grow itself for 4 mana, so it's relevant. And there's Excavation Mole, which is more geared towards a self-mill archetype or a graveyard archetype, but is a decent stat line creature as a 3 mana 3/3 that also, again, just happens to have trample. So all in all, 4 uncommons and 4 commons that have or can gain trample in this archetype, which is not bad. Couple cards I want to talk about here that can grant trample to creatures that aren't necessarily creatures themselves. There is Fully Grown, which is a 3 mana combat trick that gives a creature +3/+3 until end of turn, but also permanently puts a trample counter on it. If you are looking to bash, or you just want to give one of your fatties trample that doesn't already have it, Fully Grown will do the job. And there's also Footfall Crater, a card that I'm not quite sure whether it's going to be good or not in this format. I'm leaning towards saying no, you shouldn't play this card too often, but it is also the type of design that might just surprise me if this ends up being a fast format. It is a 1 mana enchantment that enchants a land and taps that land to give a creature trample and haste until end of turn. So obviously you can turn fatties into just hasty, trampling beaters, but you do lose a card in the exchange because you have to put this on a land. You have to use a card from your hand to start granting trample and haste to your other creatures, and that means you have to kind of play off curve as well, since you are essentially down a land if you want to use Footfall Crater. The card has cycling too, so it'll be interesting to see whether that makes it a main board card. But if you are full on fatties without trample and you're just looking for ways to make sure those creatures are going to be able to get in, I could see Footfall Crater being decent there, but I'm still not sold on it. There's also Ram Through, which is kind of an incredible spell to have just sitting around at common. It is 1 and a green for an instant common that says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. We know that card as Rabid Bite, just one-sided fight, or a bite as people like to call it. And it is instant speed, which is even better than we normally see for this card at common. Plus, it has the upside of saying if the creature you control has trample, excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller. So let's say I have a 6/6 on board and my opponent has a 4/4 and I use Ram Through and my creature has trample. It's going to kill their creature, it's going to deal 6 to their creature, and your opponent is going to take 2 because that's the excess damage, which is just an absolutely insane common, right? You're already happy with Rabid Bite, you're even happier with Instant Speed Rabid Bite, and then you are just thrilled to have Instant Speed Rabid Bite that can deal extra damage to your opponent. And I wanted to mention one rare here, Colossification. This is a 7 mana green aura that taps the creature it enchants when it enters the battlefield, but it gives that creature +20/+20 for some sick, twisted reason. If you can stick this on a trampler and then protect that trampler, you are going to win the game. Colossification, I'm not sure if this is a trap or if it's just a bomb in this set yet. We'll have to see how it plays out. But if you're going to put this on anything, you might as well put it on a creature that has trample, because you can't really chump block +20/+20 turn after turn. Next up on our list is an archetype that tends to find its way into most limited formats. That is the blue-white flying matters archetype. In this case, yes, there's a blue-white Fliers deck, but there's actual support cards that we've seen in these cycles that are going to care specifically about having Flyers on board. It's a little bit more than just draft Flyers, big blockers, and make sure your opponent doesn't kill you while killing them with evasive creatures. The big rare that you're looking at here is Sky Cat Sovereign. It is white-blue for a 1/1 rare elemental cat with with flying. 2 mana 1/1 flyer, obviously on its own is not quite cutting it, but it does get +1/+1 for each other creature you control with flying. So if you can get other flyers on board, Skycat Sovereign is going to be an actual threat that your opponent's going to have to deal with. And on top of that, you can pay 4 mana, 2 white blue, to create a 1/1 white cat bird creature token with flying. So Skycat Sovereign is kind of its own engine that creates tokens. Those tokens have flying. Those flyers pump the Sovereign. The Sovereign gets bigger and starts bashing in, right? The more flyers you have in your deck, obviously, the better Skycat Sovereign gets, but this is a good standalone card. If somehow you're in a blue-white deck that it doesn't really have a bunch of flyers, maybe you're playing some white-blue tempo beatdown deck on the ground or something like that, you would still play the Sovereign because of its mana sink ability to just create tokens, and those tokens will make the Skycat Sovereign better. So I don't know that we're excited to first pick a Skycat Sovereign, but if we're in blue-white already, we're extremely happy to open it, that's for sure. There's also Yorion, Sky Nomad, a 5 mana, 4/5 flyer. It has some hybrid mana in its mana cost. It is a rare bird serpent, and it has companion, but I'm going to ignore the companion here because it requires you to play a 60-card limited deck, which is not something you should do basically ever. And it has an enter the battlefield trigger that says exile any number of other non-land permanents you own and control. Return those cards to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. So it lets you blink as many of your non-land permanents as you want. There are not a lot of enter the battlefield triggers in this set, but there are enough that Yorion might give you an extra little bonus, especially like the Bonders that we've seen, or rather not the Bonders, but the Mentors that come down and put a counter on another creature. Yorion can always blink those so that you can get another counter on a different creature, but again, there aren't a lot of enter the battlefield triggers due to Mutate having kind of the ETB space that we would normally have. You are happy with Yorion because it does have a flexible mana cost, and it's just a big beaten flyer. It's basically a dragon. 4/5 flying creature for 5 mana is something that I would be happy to first pick, even if I didn't care about any of its extra abilities. And it does kind of have extra abilities, even though those might not come up too often. There's also Shark Typhoon, which does not directly have flying itself, so it doesn't benefit from casting spells that have flying or anything like that, but it does make flyers, whether you cast it for 6 mana, and the effect you get is that whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you make an XX flyer equal to the non-creature spell's converted mana cost, or if you cycle this away and create an XX blue shark token with flying equal to the amount of mana you paid for X while cycling it, you get flyers out of this card regardless, so it is going to be a card that you're happy to first pick, but of course I would probably lean towards the non-creature spell route if I first pick this card rather than the flying route. It does give you that flexible option though, and obviously if I'm in the Flying Matters deck, I'm playing my Shark Typhoon mostly for the Cyclone trigger, but also have the option for the cast it for 6 mana as an enchantment possibility as well. And I want to mention Luminous Broodmoth here because it is kind of just a busted flying mythic creature. It's 2 white for a 3/4 mythic insect with flying. Already happy with a 4 mana 3/4 flyer that's going to beat down and blocks a lot of the other flyers that can come down at that point in the game. And it says whenever a creature you control without flying dies, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a flying counter on it. Obviously, this doesn't actually play well with other flyers since those creatures just die and that's it. But it does make flyers out of your non-flyers, which means if your Broodmoth is on board, every creature that you have the potential to play has the potential to gain flying if it doesn't already have it. So Broodmoth, clearly busted card, does not require that you go into a Flying Matters archetype to be good, but it is very powerful nonetheless. And it is worth, for completion's sake, to mention the 4 flying rares that are off color. 2 of them include blue. One of them is in fact Jeskai blue-white, so you will play this in your Flying Matters deck. These are all really powerful rares or mythic rares, but they don't necessarily push you into a flying archetype. They're not really necessarily cards that you need to go out of your way to splash if you're in blue-white, but I wanted to mention them here because some of the commons and uncommons we'll talk about will apply to these cards if they happen to be in the same deck. Not that they will end up in the same deck too often. Now, our blue Sky Bonder is Jubilant Sky Bonder, 1 and double Azorius hybrid mana, so 3 mana total for a 2/2 flying human wizard at uncommon. So 3 mana, 2/2 flyer. We have our Windrake of the set, if you will. It says creatures you control with flying have spells your opponents cast that target this creature cost 2 more to cast. So it is harder for your opponent to target your flyers with removal spells, essentially. Note that this does not make abilities more expensive, so tap abilities and bounce abilities on board and mutate abilities and stuff like that can still target as normal, but if your opponent's going to actually spend mana on a removal spell and cast it targeting one of your flyers, they do have to pay a little bit additional. I find this ability to be a little bit hit or miss and limited. Sometimes it messes with your opponent's curve if they absolutely have to deal with one of your flyers or something like that, but it doesn't mess things up too much. It doesn't like prevent your flyers from dying, it just makes it a little bit more meddlesome to actually deal with them. If you care about this card, it has a nice little upside, but you care about it because it's a 3-mana 2/2 flyer in your Flying Matters deck. The Mentor is Wingspan Mentor, 2 and a white for a 1/3 uncommon human wizard, another 3-mana 1/3 similar to the Vigilance one, and when it enters the battlefield, put a flying counter on target non-human creature you control, so same as the rest of the cycle here. 3-mana 1/3 non-flyer that gives flying permanently to another creature might be worth playing on its own. And obviously you have the Mentor ability. This one is 2 and a blue. Tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with flying. Flying creatures, you tend to want to put extra counters on because they're evasive. They're your form of winning the game, and growing them means that you're going to win the game faster. In order to, set up a board of flyers and then play Mentor and then start activating Mentor, you do have to have some defenses. So remember, the Flying Matters deck usually wants creatures on the ground that can hold things down, like the 1-mana 0/5 or the 2-mana 1/4 Vigilance. These are dorky creatures, but they do a good job of just making sure you don't die on the ground while you get to start activating your Wingspan Mentor and attacking in the air. Outside of that, there are 3 uncommon flyers that we need to talk about. Stormwild Caprador has some weird text about preventing damage and getting +1/+1 counters. Basically, it's immune to burn spells and fight spells and things of that nature, but it's a 3-mana 1/3 flyer, which is not very good. But it is a flyer that is worth mentioning here. There's Avian Oddity, which is 3 and a blue for a 2/4 flyer, which is solid, not amazing, not bad, just solid. And it has Cycling for 2 and a blue, and when you cycle it, you can put a flying counter on target creature you control. That is, in my opinion, just a good little package of cards. Whether you need another creature on board or whether you want to give one of your creatures you already have flying, you have a little bit of flexibility there. And then there is the off-color Sprite Dragon, which I wanted to mention just because it happens to be a flyer. Sometimes you'll end up in Jeskai, where this card is actually going to see play alongside other Flying Matters cards, although it does have an ability that cares about casting non-creature spells, and it is more of a blue-red archetype card, obviously, than a white-blue card, but I wanted to mention here because it is just another uncommon with flyer. So that is, all in all, a total of 5 uncommons that either have flying or can give another creature flying. Granted, one of them is off color, but that is the most of any of the archetypes that we'll see in this video. On top of that, there are 6 common flyers, which is, again, the most that we'll see here. Either 6 common flyers or creatures that have the option of gaining flying. There's Helica Glider, which can gain first strike or flying, but I imagine will gain flying more often than not. Patasia Tiger, which is a 3/4 5-mana flyer with some upside about humans, which we don't care about too much for the sake of this video, but is an upside. There's Glimmerbell, which is a pretty dorky flyer, a 2-mana 1/3 flyer that has the option to untap it. It's meant more as kind of a target for Mutate than it is an actual flyer, but cheap flyers will do the job, and I believe this is the cheapest one you can get at common. There's also Wingfold Terran, which has the option of gaining flying or hexproof. Does not gain both, so even though you're including this in your deck, I think you're going to play this card more often for the hexproof, so you can mutate onto it, which means it doesn't necessarily count as a flyer, but it has that option. And then there are 2 mutate creatures, Dreamtail Heron and Vulpikeet, which have their own mutate synergies and stuff, but they are pretty decent flyers. 5-mana 3/4, again, 4-mana 2/3, and sometimes they're cheaper, sometimes you'll mutate onto them, sometimes you won't, but regardless, they're either flying creatures or creatures that can grant flying to another creature whenever they mutate onto that creature. On top of that, again, we want to talk about a couple spells that are specific to the flying archetype that you don't necessarily have to play in the flying archetype, but they're going to pull their weight here. The first one is Gust of Wind. This is 3 and a blue for a sorcery at common that says it costs 2 less to cast if you control a creature with flying, and the effect you get is to bounce a Nonlin permanent that you don't control to its owner's hand, and draw a card. For 4 mana, this is very clunky at sorcery speed, especially in a set where bounce may not be that effective due to Mutate. But at 2 mana, this is a very powerful and efficient spell, and it always cantrips into another card. So you would play probably the first copy in any blue deck just as a catch-all answer to something that's getting out of control on the board. But in a Flying Matters deck, this becomes much, much better as just a cheap way to interact with cards. Of course, you have to have that flyer on board, but it shouldn't be too hard if you're in the blue-white archetype. There's Spontaneous Flight, which is 2 and a white for a common instant that gives a creature +2/+2 until end of turn. 3 mana for +2/+2 is pushing the boundaries where I'm not super excited about that as a combat trick. It's not very efficient, but it does put a flying counter on a creature, which means it's going to gain flying that turn. You can use this kind of as a surprise block against an opposing flying creature, or just use it aggressively to get a flyer over the top of your opponent's creatures, and it gives a flying counter, so that creature will now permanently have flyer. This is basically an analog to Mighty Leap, which we've seen in a ton of formats, which has always been a mediocre combat trick that you use for all the cases I just highlighted, but giving a creature flying permanently might matter a little bit more in this set, and certainly gives the Flying Matters archetype an additional way to make a flyer on board. And I wanted to mention kind of an off card here that doesn't specifically care about flyers, but Reconnaissance Mission is 2 blue for an uncommon enchantment that says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. It's a very powerful effect to have on uncommon, but it does require that you actually be hitting your opponent. Best way you can hit your opponent is with either unblockable or flying creatures, so I expect Reconnaissance Mission, despite having Cyclone, to be at its best in the Flying Matters archetype. Next up, we're talking about Menace Matters in black-red, which is a very interesting archetype, although this is one of the least supported archetypes in the set, which is a little bit interesting. The cards they have are good, there just aren't quite as many cards as the other archetypes we've seen. The big rare that you're looking at is Labyrinth Raptor. It is black-red for a 2/2 rare Nightmare Dinosaur with Menace. You're already excited in an aggro deck to play a 2-mana 2/2 Menace that usually gets a couple attacks in before your opponent has the option to block it. It also says whenever a creature you control with Menace becomes blocked, defending player sacrifices a creature blocking it. That is a huge punishment. That means either A, your opponent has to have 3 creatures to block your Menace creatures, or they have to be willing to give up probably both of them, right? Now, depending on the size of the creatures that are blocking, this might not actually do too much. If your opponent, say, blocks with a 2/2 and a 3/3, they're just going to sack the 2/2, and the 3/3 will still kill off the Labyrinth Raptor, which doesn't really do anything different because this was just going to trade for that 2/2 anyway. So you can see how maybe this ability isn't as powerful as it looks, depending on the size of the creatures. But let's say you're attacking and your opponent only has giant creatures. They have 2 4/4s that they can block with. Well, they're going to lose one of their 4/4s. Labyrinth Raptor also has bonus activated ability that says black-red creatures you control with Menace get +1/+0 until end of turn. So clearly this wants to disincentivize your opponent from blocking your Menace creatures, because either they block and they're going to lose a bunch of creatures due to the triggered ability and the activated ability, or they don't block and you're just going to pump your Menace creatures, right? If you have a Labyrinth Raptor, I would look to be as aggressive as possible. I would look to try and get blockers out of the way as often as possible. Just draft as much removal as you can. And obviously, if a creature has a Menace written on it, you're going to take it. Labyrinth Raptor alongside other Menace creatures is just a nightmare for your opponent. If you attack with this plus one other Menace creature, your opponent has to have 4 creatures to block everything that you have, and they're going to immediately lose 2 of them just for blocking. So Labyrinth Raptor pays you off for A, just attacking with itself because it is a powerful creature, but it certainly pays you off for having other Menace creatures. It punishes your opponent whether they block or don't block, and that, to me, is an extremely powerful aggressive card worth building around. There is also kind of this weirdly designed card, Hunted Nightmare. It is 1 black for a 4/5 rare Nightmare with Menace. 3 mana, 4/5 Menace is an extremely powerful creature and is going to be very tough to block, but it does come with a downside. It says when it enters the battlefield, target opponent puts a death touch counter on a creature they control. Now, clearly you can mitigate that downside by playing this when your opponent doesn't have any creatures, and then you don't have to worry about anything. Plus, if you play this on a board and put a Death Touch counter on one of your opponent's creatures, that might not make too much of a difference. They've still got to double block the Nightmare, so if they only have one creature, it doesn't really make a difference that it has Death Touch or not. Or if they only have a small creature on board when you play this, then you're still going to have to double block and probably lose 2 creatures, even if the Hunted Nightmare dies in combat. I think the fact that this card can sometimes come down on turn 3 when your opponent hasn't played a creature yet and just have no downside is kind of absurd. So 3 mana 4/5 Menace is going to get in there, deal probably 8, maybe 12 damage before your opponent is comfortable blocking it. And if you blow them out with combat tricks, you just get to kind of destroy them and win the game. Hunted Nightmare has a real downside. It is a very balanced card, but there are times that you can offset that balance depending on how the game's going, and in that case, it is quite bomby. There is our uncommon Bonder for the Menace archetypes, Sonorous Howlbinder. It is 1 and double black-red hybrid mana, so 3 mana total for a 2/2 Menace creature. It's an uncommon human warrior, and it gives all of your Menace creatures Super Menace. Each creature you control with Menace can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures. So unless your opponent has 6, 9 creatures on board, they can probably at most block a single Menace creature at a time. Again, there aren't a ton of Menace creatures in this set, but there are enough that if you have a couple on board, Sonorous Howlbinder is going to make some of them unblockable, if not all of them, right? If your opponent has 2 creatures on board, they just can't block your Menace creatures while Sonorous Howlbinder is on board, which means you get to push in extra damage, and even if they can block one of them, there's no way they're blocking multiple Menace creatures, so you can sometimes just turn sideways, and your opponent might be able to kill one of your creatures in combat, but the rest of your creatures are getting through that turn. Our mentor for Menace is Frill Scare Mentor. It is 2 and a red for a 3/2 uncommon human warrior. Those are fine stats compared to the 3 mana 1/3s that we've seen in some of the other ones. The white and blue ones start off pretty weak, but give relevant abilities. The red and green ones have a pretty good start in vanilla base and then give extra abilities. This one, when it enters the battlefield, put a Menace counter on target non-human creature you control, and then for 2 and a red, tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on every creature you control with Menace. And obviously, growing Menace creatures, I don't have to explain why that's good, because your opponent, if they want to deal with them, have to double block, and the bigger they are, the more likely it is that you turn your Menace creatures into natural 2-for-1s in combat. Plus, sometimes your opponent can't block, and that just means you're pushing in extra damage. So Frill Scale Mentor, probably a decent card in any red deck, but at its best, obviously, in the Menace archetype. There are also a couple other uncommons here, neither of which naturally have Menace, but both of which can gain Menace or create a creature with Menace. The first one is Grim Dancer, which is an extremely powerful card for just a mid-range beater. It is 1 black for a 3/3 uncommon nightmare, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose Menace, Death Touch, Lifelink. You choose 2 of those, and it gets a counter of each of those. So you can make this a Menace Death Toucher or a Menace Lifelinker, or you can make it a Death Touch Lifelinker, which you will do a decent amount of the time, but Menace plus Death Touch is a really nasty combination, because no matter what your opponent blocks with, this is going to trade off for 2 creatures, which makes it pseudo-unblockable a decent amount of the time, or means that your opponent has to throw some tokens in the mix, or just accept the fact that they're going to lose 2 creatures if they engage in combat on blocks. Grim Dancer, very powerful card. You would play this in any black deck, whether you cared about Menace or not, and sometimes it will gain Death Touch and Lifelink, even though that combination won't come up too often when compared to like Menace Lifelink or Menace Death Touch. There is also Call of the Death Dweller, which is 2 and a black for an uncommon sorcery that says return up to 2 target creature cards with total converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Put a Death Touch counter on either of them, then put a Menace counter on either of them. So clearly not a creature, but it creates a creature that will have Menace. Whether it creates 2 or not doesn't matter. It is going to create a Menace creature, and I wanted to mention it here. This can get back any 3-drop, or it can get back a 1-drop and a 2-drop. Hopefully it's getting back 2 creatures, that way it's an actual 2-for-1, and then you can put Death Touch on the dorky creature, and you can put Menace on the 2/2, which is relevant, right? Especially if some of these other archetypal cards going on, then your 2/2 Menace creature can get better. But yeah, I wanted to mention Call of the Death Dweller, and I am treating it basically as a Menace creature, which brings the total for the Menace deck up to 4 uncommon creatures that either have Menace or can gain Menace, which is a decent amount. That was more than the Vigilance archetype, but less than the Flying archetype. It's about on par with the Trample archetype. As far as the commons go, there are only 2 commons in this set that have Menace. There's Cavern Whisperer, which is another 5 mana 4/4 with Menace, and whenever it mutates, your opponent discards a card. The mutate cost is 4 mana. And there's the Ferocious Tigorilla that we mentioned for the Trample archetype, the 4 mana 4/3 that can gain either Trample or Menace. Depends on what the board state looks like. What you do with that depends on what the board state looks like. These cards are both fine. They're not like, cards that you take early and you feel like you need to move into a Menace archetype or anything like that. But they are cards that once you're in red-black, you're happy to wheel them or pick them up at a certain point, especially if you have the Lords or the payoff cards for this archetype. So the Menace deck is not super well supported. It only has 2 commons and 4 uncommons that care about Menace on top of the 2 rares that we mentioned. All in all, that's 8 creatures with Menace in the set, or rather 8 creatures or spells that create Menace creatures, which is not a lot compared to some of the other archetypes, but the cards they do have are very potent. There's also 2 spells that we want to talk about here for the Menace archetype. The first one is Blood Curdle. This is 3 and a black for a common instant that destroys target creature and then puts a Menace counter on a creature you control. This is just black's probably best common removal spell in the set, and because of that, it means that if you're in the Menace archetype, don't expect to get rewarded with this card, because every single player at the table is going to be first picking this, regardless of whether they're black or not. It's very splashable. This is going to go within the first 3 picks of essentially every single Magic pack that's drafted in person. Maybe on Arena you get hooked up, but in real life you're not going to get this card late. So even though it's good in the Menace deck, it's not going to be something you get rewarded with when you're actually drafted in person. There's also Tentative Connection, which is 3 and a red for your threaten effect. It gains control of target creature till end of turn, untaps it, gains haste, blah, 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 all of that usual stuff. 4 mana for this effect is way too much, especially in a set that doesn't have a lot of ways to sacrifice creatures, but it does have the upside that says it costs 3 less to cast this spell if you control a creature with Menace. If you are an extremely hyper-aggressive deck and you have a bunch of Menace creatures on board and you're just looking to push in as much damage as possible as early as possible, you might play a Tentative Connection, because 1 mana to steal your opponent's best creature for the turn might just be enough and efficient enough to push in for a win. So look for sacrifice effects if you're playing Tentative Connection. Don't look at it as like the biggest Menace payoff in the world. Same thing as Blood Curdle. But just note that if you are trying to be aggressive, it is a tool that you have here in this limited format. And that brings us to our final archetype, which is a really weird archetype to have in Limited, but they've been doing a lot of this lately. And the color pair blue-black is Flash Matters, where you want to cast stuff at instant speed, but mainly you want to look for cards that actually say the word Flash on them. And that is because the main rare here, Slitherwisp, is very, very good. It's blue, black, black for a rare elemental nightmare. It is a 3/2 with flash, so very hard to cast 3 mana 3/2 with flash, but the upside's pretty big. It says whenever you cast another spell that has flash, you draw a card and each opponent loses a life. So if I had this in my pool and I knew I was playing blue-black and I wasn't stretching the mana too much to play it, yeah, I'm going to draft every single flash card that I can. It's kind of like that not Breach and Hippocamp, but the Wave Break Hippocamp from Theros Beyond Death that drew you a card when you cast your first spell on your opponent's turn, except way better because they lose life, and it's not just the first spell, it's every flash spell you cast. Your opponent is going to lose some life, and you're going to replace them. If you can get enough flash cards, you can actually just chain things together and kill your opponent very quickly with this. Plus, it itself has flash, so you can kind of dodge certain removal spells and get a couple triggers off of it before your opponent actually deals with it. There is also Dirge Bat, which is kind of an insane generic black card that happens to have flash. It's 2 black for a 3/3 fly-in flash creature that says whenever it mutates, destroy target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. The mutate cost is 6. So yeah, this is a 4 mana 3/3 flash flyer, which is already a good card, but it's also a 6 mana kill spell if you cast it for its mutate cost, and still has flash whether you mutate it or not. So you can instant speed kill something, upgrade something by mutating, or downgrade if you want. And you have the option to just play this as your 4-mana 3/3. So an obviously very good card. It's going to be first picked out of every single pack, and it does fit the flash archetype. Same goes for Sea Dasher Octopus. This is the cheapest mutate creature you can get, and it also has flash. It's 1 blue for a 2/2 that says whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card with flash, which is already a card that you would probably play a decent amount of the time. Kind of funny, because there's a common in this set that has the same exact ability, stats, and mana cost. It's a 3-mana 2/2 that draws a card when it deals damage, but this one has flash and mutate, which makes it more desirable for this blue-black archetype. There's also Voracious Great Shark, which is 5 mana, 3 blue for a 5/4 rare shark with flash, and when it enters battlefield, counter target artifact or creature spell. We don't even care about the counter, even though this is going to be very annoying to have on the opposite side of the table. It is just going to wreck a ton of limited games, but hey, big beater with flash is what you're looking for this archetype. There's Shark Typhoon, which again doesn't necessarily have flash, but does give you an instant speed way to play things, and as we'll mention at the end of this section, you do want counter spells and ways to use your mana if you're in a flash deck. That way you give yourself more options, or if it's not the opportune time to flash in a creature, you have other things to do with your mana. So Shark Typhoon functions as a flash creature, but doesn't actually have the word flash on it, which matters for some of the payoff cards. And then finally, there's Lutri, the Spell Chaser, which is interesting because it's an Izzet card, but due to the hybrid mana, you can actually cast this in a blue-black deck pretty easily. It's 1 double Izzet mana, so 3 mana total for a 3/2 flash with some companion text that might be relevant in limited. And when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you can copy an instant or sorcery you control and choose new targets for the copy. So obviously a pretty good card. You might be able to pull this one off in limited for its companion cost, and despite being an Izzet card, is another flash creature that you have at your disposal for the blue-black deck. Now, interestingly enough, despite having 2 cards in the cycles for each archetype, the blue-black deck only has the Cunning Nightbonder. It does not have the Mentor because the Black Mentor has like this lifelink matters theme to it. And I guess that makes sense because flash counters aren't a thing here. They wouldn't make sense, and growing your flash creatures would be kind of a weird mechanic. But we do still have the Nightbonder, which is double blue-black. So 2 mana, 2/2, flash, uncommon human rogue, and your spells with flash cost 1 less to cast and can't be countered. This is the cheapest of the bonders. It is a perfectly fine card. A lot of these flash cards, as we saw, have pretty reasonable mana costs, and this does reduce all of those. They can't be countered as well, and I expect this to be a format where people are playing their counter spells. So I think the kind of Nightbonder is pretty good. Pretty easy to cast in the deck due to its hybrid mana. It does not really pay you off for having flash creatures, but it does make those flash cards easier to cast. And note that it specifically says spells with flash, not spells that can be cast as though they had flash, or spells that can be cast at instant speed or instance themselves. They actually have to have the word flash written on them or have an effect that gives them the actual keyword flash, which we'll see on one of the comments here. Another uncommon, and the only other uncommon flash creature in the set, is Pouncing Shore Shark. 4 in a blue for a 4/3 uncommon flash creature, and when it mutates, you may return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. We've already mentioned kind of the downsides of bounce spells in this format with the Gust of Wind card, but Pouncing Shore Shark has all of the same things. Could be a huge blowout for your opponent. Instant speed bounce on top of a 4/3 creature seems pretty decent. I don't know how this card's going to play out in the format, but we're mentioning it here because it's an uncommon with flash, which means the blue-black flash matters archetype only has 2 uncommons in this set, which is pretty low. That's the lowest that we've seen of any of these archetypes yet. And though there are a couple commons here, there aren't that many more, right? There are a total of 4 common creatures with flash. A lot of them are pretty dorky, like the Crustacean and the Adaptive Shimmer, which is meant more for like an adapt deck than it is, or not an adapt deck, but a mutate deck than it is for a flash deck. But you do have Working Deadeye and Blitzleech, which have these weird instant speed kind of removal-y type effects to them. I don't think you want too many of any of these cards unless you're specifically in these archetype. I do think Blitz Leech and Lurking Deadeye are cards that you'll probably play as one-ofs in most of your black decks, but the Crustacean and the Adaptive Shimmer are cards I really only want if my deck cares about having actual cards with the word Flash on it. Note that there are also a couple non-creature spells with Flash. There's Capture Sphere, which we've seen before as a 4-mana instant speed Flash aura that taps a creature and stops it from untapping. So basically a Flash removal spell, but it does keep the creature on board. Tends to play really well, I think, against Mutate, since the nature of Mutate is if you can deal with a mutated stack, you're probably getting a 2 or 3 for 1 off of the deal. And there's also Mystic Subdual, which is 1 in a blue for a Flash aura that gives the enchanted creature -2/-0 and makes it lose all abilities, which also stops mutate triggers. These cards play very well in the Flash archetype, because they have Flash, but also because you want your stuff to be instant speed so that if you're not flashing in creatures and you need to actually respond to what your opponent's doing, you have options like this to do so. And then I did want to mention Mutual Destruction, which is a single black mana for a sorcery. It's Bone Splinter, so you sacrifice a creature as a cost, and then the effect you get is Destroy Target Creature, which is a tried and true card. You do want some sort of tokens laying around to make this card really good, but hey, Mutual Destruction is going to be fine, and it has this upside that says this spell has Flash as long as you control a permanent with Flash. Now, this obviously doesn't really matter for the Nightbonder because it reducing the cost doesn't do anything. It does make it uncounterable, but this spell will actually have the word Flash on it, which means if you have the rare, the Slither Wisp, you do get to draw a card off Mutual Destruction, which is kind of nice. And then finally, there is Springjaw Trap, and while I don't recommend playing this card because it's really bad, I did want to go ahead and mention it here because it is just another spell in this set that has Flash. It's a pretty bad artifact removal spell that for 5 mana total deals 3 damage to something. Not really worth it in limited. It's like desperation removal, but it does have Flash, so let's go ahead and do our due diligence and mention every card here. And then finally, as mentioned before, you do probably want counter spells in this archetype. They tend to play very well with a Flash theme because you can hold up mana for a counter spell, and if they don't play into the counter spell or they don't cast anything, you can just choose to cast something with Flash instead. So finding ways to sink your mana on turns where your opponent doesn't give you a good timing to cast a Flash card or something like that is a pretty good way to play these sorts of decks out. And that's going to go ahead and do it for our first video. This one went on quite a while, but I wanted to cover all of the keyword archetypes all at the same time. Next time we'll talk about the Cyclone deck, which is going to be in Jeskai colors, and we will probably also break off and talk about the Blue-Red Spells Matters deck, which is kind of tossed in there at the same time. If you enjoyed this video, or if it's been informative, it's helped you in any way, shape, or form, feel free to subscribe to the channel below for more content like this. You can find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks, and I thank you all for being here and watching. My name is Timothy with ManaRocks. Thank you all, and I'll see you all next time.